Hello, and welcome to HemiScope. I'm Peter Smith, Professor of Latin American Studies here at the University of California, San Diego, and your host for this evening's program. As you'll see, we have expanded our format to 1 full hour and have developed some new segments to broaden our exploration of issues and culture in Latin America. We'll continue with our in-depth discussions about events in the hemisphere, and tonight we'll follow with a story about El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead traditions in Mexico. Then we'll close with clips from a talk by Anthony DePalma, the New York Times correspondent who has written a new book called Here, a biography of the new American continent. It's about the ties that bind the 3 countries of North America, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. But first, a roundup of reaction in Latin America to the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. The horrendous attacks of September 11th against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have provoked sensations of horror, disbelief, anger, and sadness in every part of the world, including Latin America. Throughout our hemisphere, the initial and continuing reaction has focused on the human dimensions of this unspeakable tragedy. The wanton destruction of thousands of innocent lives has met with anguish and revulsion everywhere, and the heroic actions of Americans, firefighters, police officers, soldiers, ordinary citizens, has drawn widespread admiration. Outpourings of sympathy and solidarity have extended from Mexico to Argentina, from Chile, all the way to Cuba. This is partly due to the fact that scores of Latin American citizens from Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador, most countries of the region, in fact, lost their lives in those fateful infernos. It also reflects a time-honored reality of inter-American relations. Latin Americans might not always like our policies, but they have almost always showed affection for our people. Yet almost from the beginning, there was apprehension about the character of the U.S. response. Analysts called for caution, prudence, and care, and warned of the dangers of war. As one commentator put it, for certain there must be punishment for those who committed this crime, but the punishment and the reprisals should solve the problem, not make it even more intractable. And so it was with apprehension that Latin Americans anticipated President George W. Bush's September 20th speech, a statement to the joint houses of Congress, to the American people, and to the world at large. The president called for a long and determined campaign against terrorism and declared that every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. From this day forward, he said, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. Reactions in Latin America were mixed. The president of Uruguay, Jorge Baille, proclaimed that he was totally in agreement with President Bush and proposed to encourage a vigorous collaboration on the part of all South American nations with the government of the United States. President Ricardo Lagos of Chile agreed that the U.S. had the right to respond to the September 11 attacks, but added that the most important thing was not to punish innocent people in the course of that response. The foreign minister of Peru, Diego Garcia Sayan, described the president's speech as realistic and prudent. Others did not quite share this view. Populist President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela declared that his country strongly supported the struggle against terrorism, but could not support any action that, in his words, might damage the fundamental principles of human rights and international law. There was also outright criticism of the U.S. stance. In the Mexican newspaper La Jornada, editorialists wrote that the Bush speech intoned a death knell for the new code of international justice that had been in the making since the end of the Cold War. In their words, Washington has now proclaimed itself to be the police, prosecutor, and judge for the entire world, and other nations would have to follow its orders and dictates. Or if not, they could be exposed to military attack from the United States. For the writers of La Jornada, the entire concept of national sovereignty was at stake. The day after President Bush's speech to Congress, foreign ministers from around the hemisphere met at the Organization of American States to approve resolutions expressing solidarity with the United States and opposition to terrorism. The ministers invoked the Rio Treaty of 1947, which had declared that, quote, an armed attack on one member is to be considered an attack upon all. Accordingly, the ministers agreed that these terrorist acts against the United States of America are attacks against all American states. And they vowed that their governments would, quote, render additional assistance and support to the United States and to each other as appropriate to address the September 11th attacks and also to prevent future terrorist acts. Upon inspection, we can see that the diplomatic language concealed some crucial qualifications. One was the statement that Latin American countries would provide assistance as appropriate, whatever that means. Another was the insistence on using democratic and legal means rather than military force in the anti-terrorist campaign. In short, this was not a call to arms, nor was it an automatic declaration of war on Afghanistan or Iraq or anyone else, nor did it mean that Latin America would necessarily provide the United States with military assistance. Foreign ministers from all parts of the region repeatedly claimed that the OAS resolution did not provide the Bush administration with, quote, a blank check. Interestingly enough, the OAS resolution barely avoided a diplomatic impasse between the United States and Mexico. Only days before the attacks, President Vicente Fox of Mexico had dismissed the Rio Pact as obsolete and useless. And on the eve of the OAS meeting, Fox stunned U.S. officials by declaring that the Rio Treaty was, quote, not the ideal mechanism for dealing with terrorism. As pressure mounted, however, Mexico abandoned its position. As Foreign Minister Jorge Castañeda said, we do not think it is the proper way to go, but we will go along with it. The Bush speech and the OAS resolutions have major implications for other countries as well. One is Colombia, where a pro-U.S. government faces persisting challenges from armed guerrilla groups that have been labeled as terrorists by the United States. Observers now argue that the U.S. anti-terrorist campaign puts new pressure on those guerrilla groups to reach peace accords with the Colombian government, and fast, or face the prospect of U.S. military intervention. Also affected is Cuba, long hostile to the United States, and one of 7 countries labeled by the U.S. government as sponsors of international terrorism. Fidel Castro denounced the attacks on New York and Washington as a colossal injustice and a great crime. Come what may, he vowed, our country will never be used for terrorist attacks against the people of the United States. Castro presumably had 3 motives. Almost certainly, one was to take Cuba off the suspect list. Another may have been to seek rapprochement with Washington. Yet another was to speak for the people of Cuba, who were genuinely horrified by the terrorist assault. Not long ago, Fidel clarified his position against terrorism and also against war. Amidst this welter of discussion and debate, pearls of wisdom have shone through. One was an analysis by Felix Peña in the Buenos Aires newspaper La Nación. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, he wrote, are a savage expression of irrationality. The great challenge for all of us now is to demonstrate that irrationality cannot triumph over rationality. That will take time. For now, Peña continued, Argentina and Brazil should strengthen their alliance and thus contribute to peace, democracy, rationality, and social solidarity throughout South America. In other words, nations of the world should not only await the U.S. response, they should shoulder their own responsibilities. Another insightful analysis came from Roberto da Mata, a distinguished Brazilian anthropologist writing in the newspaper Folha de São Paulo. For da Mata, 3 things revealed sharp cultural differences between the United States and Brazil. First was the fact that America's political leaders, governors, mayors, even the president, left their offices to attend to the victims, the injured and the dying. That would hardly ever happen in Brazil. Second, Brazilians tended to interpret the September 11th attacks as the end of the world, as the onset of the apocalypse. But for America, in DeMata's view, it marked the beginning of a new era, one that would test the strength of social values and of our democratic institutions. Finally, DeMata commented on displays of the American flag. In Brazil and other Latin American countries, flag waving tends to be associated with nationalism, authoritarianism, militarism, and even repression. In the United States, by contrast, the flag is an expression of community. By saluting the flag, DeMata observed, Americans heal their wounds, go back to their routines, and feel themselves to be part of a whole. The stars and stripes allow them to feel the magic of their sociability, to imagine the future, the destiny that will outlast their lives. In looking at Latin America, we thus obtain a window on the world, and as so often happens, a window on ourselves as well. Next tonight, the fragile economy of Argentina and its potential danger for surrounding countries. An economic rescue plan is underway in Argentina as that country tries to climb out of a 3-year recession. Argentina was seen to be on the brink of financial collapse, saved only by radical reform of the country's budget and an $8 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. The austerity measures include a hefty rise in taxes and severe salary cuts for federal government workers. Protesters argued that the cuts were too steep, but Argentine President Fernando de la Rúa said to save his country, he had no other choice.
Que fortalece nuestra economía y asegura nuestro futuro.
The plan is our only way out, the safe way out, which strengthens our economy and secures our future. The only way out. For this reason, the details are not negotiable. They are absolutely necessary to overcome the difficult situation we are now in.
After a protracted display of reluctance, the United States finally showed its support for de la Rua's plan by voting in favor of the IMF bailout. President Bush said it would restore investor confidence in Argentina and help the country avoid defaulting on its multi-billion-dollar debt. Argentina is the third largest economy in Latin America. Its predicament has important implications for other countries in the region. My guests tonight are Carlos Weisman, a professor of sociology here at the University of California, San Diego, and an expert on Argentina, and Lawrence Krauss, professor emeritus at UCSD's Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, and a well-known international economist. Welcome, gentlemen, to HemiScope. And Carlos, let me start with you. What happened? Argentina was a great success story of the 1990s with growth rates averaging around 5%, new investment, stable control of inflation. Everything seemed to be going forward. What happened?
Well, it was a success story in terms of beginning economic liberalization. It was not a success story in terms of what is called second-generation reforms. Essentially, Argentina opened its economy quite substantially, even though it has a customs union with Brazil and other countries in the Southern Cone, what is called Mercosur, whose external tariffs are still quite high, around 12 or 14%, more than twice those of Chile.
Right. Mercosur is known as the common market of the South.
Exactly.
That binds Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay.
So there was a very substantial opening of the economy, but Argentina is still a relatively protected market. There was a radical process of privatization. There was substantial deregulation, but some markets in Argentina are still very highly regulated. The labor market is still very rigid, and this is one of the reasons for the existence of a very high rate of unemployment. But what is missing are the reforms that would strengthen the regulatory capacity of the state, the capacity of the state to provide law and order. Argentina is still a country in which the rule of law is not very strongly institutionalized, in which there is still a very high level of corruption, and in which very basic functions that the state should provide, such as public education, public health, and social welfare, are not carried out in a very effective manner.
Now, some have said that Argentina, having tied its peso to the dollar, has gotten itself in a situation where its exports are hampered and its imports are swelling and burgeoning, and it simply cannot sustain this situation which helped create the debt that Argentina now has. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's a very complicated situation because a prominent Argentine politician has called the fixed rate a trap, in the sense that it was not easy not to get into it, and once you are into it, it's not easy to get out. The reason for the fixed rate is that after several decades of high inflation and a bout of hyperinflation between 1989 and 1991, Argentina had 4-digit rates of inflation. No one, absolutely no one in the society trusted the currency printed by the Argentine government. The Argentine government would routinely incur very high deficit and finance the deficit with printing money. So I'm not talking about investors or capitalists or big savers. I'm talking about your cab driver would convert every Argentine peso he had or she had into dollars or other foreign currencies. So the only way to establish a modicum of confidence in the Argentine currency was not only by establishing a fixed rate, by guaranteeing it with currency foreign reserves. So essentially, Argentina established a currency board according to which the government can only print money if it has reserves that match the amount that it is issuing.
Well, Larry, let me turn to you on this question of virtual dollarization, which for a while seemed to be an answer to Argentina's economic problems. Do you see that as part of the cause of Argentina's current predicament? And is it a good recipe for other countries of the region as well to virtually dollarize their economies?
It's a high-risk strategy, but one which Argentina had little choice about because they had reformed so many times that failed. This was the last chance. But when you're in a customs union with other countries that are free to devalue, as Brazil has done very heavily, then your competitiveness can be lost quickly. So it's a risk there. Now it means that to regain competitiveness, Argentina's price level has to drop. Now that's hard to do. It has happened the last few years, but only with severe crisis and unemployment and recession. So Argentina has chosen, because it must, a very drastic road. Other countries have more choices than Argentina did, so it may not fit others.
Would you agree with the idea that once you get into this situation of a currency board and dollarization, that it's very hard to get out, that you lock yourself into a strategy that is more or less unchangeable?
It's very hard to make a small change, because if they tried to devalue 3 or 5%, immediately everyone would cash in their pesos, and you'd be back to the old circumstance in which there was essentially no local currency. So I think you are locked into it.
And tell me, the bailout, the IMF rescue bailout, whatever you want to call it, do you think it was warranted? That is, U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill seemed to be very, very reluctant, said some things about Argentina that were not well received in Buenos Aires, and raised some serious doubts about whether this was a good idea and seemed to be dragged along at the last minute. In retrospect, was it the appropriate policy step to take, or should O'Neill and the U.S. government have held the line?
It was necessary. It was correct. Ideology in the U.S. was standing in the way of doing the obvious things. If anything, the events of September 11th have made it even more likely that further bailouts could come forward, because it's in no one's interest to see Argentina have a financial meltdown, which would then or possibly spread to other countries. So I think there's some leeway that have been cut for Argentina, even not to live up to the letter of some of the agreements they've already made. I think Argentina, as a small gain from the crisis will be given a lot of help. The numbers in world levels are small.
But Argentina really represented a possible contagion for the rest of South America. I mean, as part of the logic that it was necessary to contain the Argentine crisis so that it did not spread to, say, Brazil and other countries of South America. Was there that kind of risk of fallout?
There's that kind of risk, but it's more than just Latin America. Argentina has so many bonds outstanding that they're a major part of world portfolios. If you really had a flight from fixed asset portfolios around the world, then you could see a contagion spreading to Russia or Korea or Taiwan. It could have drastic consequences.
Well, let's come back to Argentina, Carlos, for a moment. Within Argentina, what are the social impacts of A, this 3-year recession, and B, the IMF package? Who is suffering and what are the implications of that?
Well, the impact of the recession is really extraordinary. In order to assess this impact, I think it's useful to return to the situation Argentina had before the beginning of economic liberalization, because people tend to compare the situation now with the situation in the 1980s, for instance. In the early 80s, the proportion of the population under the poverty line in Argentina was 4%.
Was, excuse me?
4%.
4%, below the poverty line.
According to World Bank estimates at that time. Now it's about 1/3 of the population. Unemployment was never a very serious problem in Argentina because, in fact, Argentina had an economy based on labor shortage until the 1970s, and this is one of the factors that explains the very strong influence that trade unions had for most of the second half of the 19th century. In this moment, the rate of unemployment is at least 16%, and the rate of underemployment is probably similar. So there is no question that social inequality has increased dramatically in Argentina.
Well, part of that was presumably due to the debt crisis of the 1980s, but one might have thought during the course of the expansion of the 1990s that this situation would get better. Did that occur?
Well, not completely, because economic liberalization tends to dualize the society. So large segments of not only of the economic elites, but also of the middle classes and even of the working classes did benefit from the expansion of service activities and even some industries like the automobile industry, while other regions, social classes, and segments of different classes were decimated. So inequality increased during the 90s. Since the recession began, the standard of living of most groups in the society, including prosperous segments of the middle classes, has worsened. Now, the measures that the government has taken have been quite irresponsible, in my view, until very recently, let's say until the very recent bailout. When in the mid-90s, the Argentine debt was about 1/4 of the GDP. Now it's about 50% of the GDP.
So it doubled as a proportion
Exactly.
of GDP.
When this government took office in at the end of 1999, the spread between Argentine and American bonds was about 7 or 800 basic points, that is to say 7 or 8%. Now the spread is about 16%. So what the government did, instead of cutting the budget, was to keep getting into debt at higher and higher rates. Now, cutting the budget in the middle of a recession is not easy. And some of the cuts have been very, very drastic. In addition to cutting the salaries of government employees by 13%, the government also reduced the pensions of all the retirees making more than $500, I think, also by 13%. The next stage of budget cuts will include a drastic modification of revenue sharing, so provincial governments will suffer. So the big question is whether there will be social and political limits to the budget, to the zero budget policy. Say in order to survive without a default, the Argentine government should be able to maintain zero deficit from now on and also restructure much of its debt. In the new environment, I am not sure really that this could be easily done.
Well, part of the local environment is upcoming congressional elections in the middle of October, and the constant questioning of whether the Minister of the Treasury of the Economy, Domingo Cavallo, will stay on. Now, let me ask you about the political implications as Argentina heads into these elections, and as there's this constant speculation about Cavallo and his loyalty to De la Rua. What's your anticipation? Will this government come out of those elections able to govern? It sounds like a situation where you need a strong hand, and will De la Rua and or Cavallo be able to exercise it after those elections?
Well, my impression is that whatever happens, the government will lose the elections, in the sense that even the parties in the government coalition are opposing government policy. And in fact, the opposition party, the Peronists, are behaving, are more supportive to the general economic policy of the government than the radical party, the president's party. So the possibility of implementing the zero deficit policy after elections in which the government will be extraordinarily weakened hinge on some kind of grand coalition, even a passive coalition, let's say, that would involve the leadership of the major parties. Now, the history of many countries, including Argentina, shows that rationality suddenly comes to people's minds when they are at the edge of the cliff. And again, Argentina began its economic liberalization also in a situation of major economic crisis in which clearly there was no option.
Larry, let me turn to you for a moment. Excuse me, Carlos. As you hear this political analysis, you mentioned earlier that you thought Argentina might get a little bit of slack in the wake of recent events. Are you still optimistic? It sounded as though you were optimistic about Argentina's situation.
Well, I think that they will be doing drastic things, and they will argue, probably correctly, that they will have pushed the country's tolerance to the limit. And you get slack when you admit that you can't do any more and people believe it. So I think in terms of not a zero deficit, but a small deficit, that would be probably acceptable to the world community.
For the international economic community, how important is the person of Domingo Cavallo, the Minister of the Economy who joined the government about a year ago, I think, and who was associated with the plan to peg the peso to the dollar and is in many ways, in the view of many Argentines, a hero, in the view of other Argentines, not so much a hero. But how much of the credibility of Argentina's government depends on him and his staying on in his position?
I think it's very important. If he should resign with a blast against political parties, then I think confidence in Argentina would be completely lost abroad.
And is that a reasonable possibility, Carlos? That is, if these elections are simply devastating for the government, after all, Cavallo has his own political party. What do you think the chances of that might be?
I would say, in terms of what should be his overall political strategy and the government's overall political strategy, the only solution is a grand coalition that involves Cavallo as the finance minister. However, there are personality issues involved. He has a very unusual personality. He very often tends to enter unnecessary fights. It says his attacks on the Brazilian government are legendary. He has attacked many people in Argentina. There may be a situation in which it's not easy for him to continue. But my expectation is that he will be the finance minister after the elections.
Larry, you mentioned Argentina's relationship with Brazil, which is really the core of Mercosur, the common market of the South. It has been said that this arrangement is good for Brazil because they can devalue and continue to export to Argentina, and is bad for Argentina because they've got this peso that is pegged to the dollar, and they can import, but they can't export. Is that a fair reading, and does this portend difficulty for Mercosur in the long run, do you think?
It may well be that an adjustment in Mercosur is going to be absolutely necessary, and will come about when Argentina threatens to pull out. You could see an adjustment, sliding scale, depending on the relationship of the currencies between Brazil and Argentina. That would in fact be a new tariff level just to the devaluing countries. It's a messy system, but it may be the only alternative to keep the Mercosur going.
Laura, you mentioned September 11 and its aftermath. What do you think is the prospect for both the hemispheric economy and the world economy in the wake of those events and as these reactions unfold?
Well, the crisis itself tipped a weak U.S. economy into a recession. But it's the kind of recession that may be just postponed consumption. So the expectation is, while you might see negative quarters in third and fourth quarter, the first quarter in the U.S. will be a positive and a more robust recovery in the second quarter than you might have seen otherwise. But the rest of the world reflects that. And therefore, you're going to see trade flows weaken considerably for everyone. Now, along with this is a decline of interest rates worldwide. So it has this benefit for debtors that will see the structural world interest rates go down. And it is still true that monetary policy is the most effective policy against slowdowns, and the Federal Reserve in the U.S. is anxious, I think, to prevent a prolonged slowdown.
Final question for you, Carlos, in the seconds that remain. What has been the reaction to September 11 in Argentina, to the terrorist attacks? What kind of issues have come up, and what is the perspective of the Argentine citizenry?
Well, the reaction that you could read about in the newspapers and statements by politicians and intellectuals and so on was, of course, revulsion at the attacks and solidarity with the New Yorkers and the Americans. The debate in Argentina hinged about two issues. First, how strong should be the Argentine participation? So should Argentina participate in the military response? Most people think that it shouldn't. And secondly, the vulnerability of Argentina to terrorist attacks. There were two major incidents of terrorist action attributed to Islamic fundamentalists in Argentina in the early 90s. The Israeli embassy was blown up, and a Jewish community center was also attacked.
So grief is shared, pain is throughout the hemisphere. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Larry. Next up, the altar for Mexico's Day of the Dead. We turn now to UCSD TV's Graciela Sevilla.
In traditional Mexican pueblos, ancestors are remembered on November 2nd with customs marking Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. Combining indigenous and Catholic rituals, Mexican families who keep tradition visit the grave sites of loved ones or create home shrines to family members who've died. Often misinterpreted as grim or mournful, Day of the Dead rituals instead celebrate the lives of the departed and help the living maintain an important connection to the past. In a private home, a shrine is typically built on a table draped with the family's best tablecloth. Photographs of the dead loved ones and mementos from their lives are set out along with their favorite foods and beverages. To help us interpret the Day of the Dead practices, we spoke with Mary Lou Valencia, a San Diego artist and lecturer on indigenous Mexican rituals who carries on the tradition. Our interview took place just days after the terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. Throughout our conversation, our thoughts turned often to our nation's grief. Not unlike the Mexican tradition, the events on September 11th have inspired the creation of many street-side shrines honoring the lives lost.
Rituals like this, community expression done individually and in a group, really give us a vehicle to mourn, no? They give us a way to express that grief. They give us a way to bring our lives back into balance. And I think that that's one of the beauties of this ceremony, as opposed to just seeing Day of the Dead as a cultural expression, or seeing it as a folkloric activity, because these are real people. And this event allows us to remember them, to cry with them, to be enjoyed by them. It allows us to celebrate them in their lives, and by acknowledging them in our lives and how they impacted us, we give value to their memory, we give value to life. The tradition as we know it now has came in from different directions now. You have the indigenous pre-Columbian tradition, you have the Catholic colonial tradition, and then you have the synchronicity of the two traditions in our times now. You know, it really was a Central Mexican tradition, and from that has gone out as we know it. A lot of those, the Yoreme and the Chichimeca and the Zapotec and the Totonacos and the Otomi, all of those tribes, you have to remember that those tribes aren't dead. They're still alive. They're still functioning in their traditional pueblos. They're still doing their ceremonies. And these same elements still continue on the altars. You have the flowers, the candles, sacred images. You have images of those that have passed on, and those are the spirits that you're inviting. A modern urban altar, you know, that tradition continues. You have the elements that represent earth, air, fire, water, the elements that we're made out of, the elements that surround us. You have the flowers of Huitzilopochtli, you know, that look like a little sun, the flower of 1,000 petals. And that white smoke still carries those prayers, you know, and smoke, sacred smoke, is an element that all humanity shares in their pre-urban traditions. For us, that white smoke, that white eagle, Itztacuautli, represents physical manifestation of our words rising up to the Creator Spirit. The tradition almost died even in Mexico, and the people that kept it alive were those little indigenous communities in Pátzcuaro and Tula and Puebla and Oaxaca. And the Chicanos returning to do investigative research, saying, you know, this is part of who we are. It's what makes us. This puts us in link with all of our ancestors and all of those people that struggled. Because believe me, it is a struggle, a daily struggle, to keep these traditions alive in an urban setting that daily tells you that these have no value because they're not techno, they're not modern, they're not hip, they're not cool, they're not easy, they're not quick, they're not fun. To see a resurgence of this tradition really speaks a lot about the Chicano, Mexicano in the United States.
The elements on the altar also combine the sacred with the profane. The candles, incense, and sacred images share space with light-hearted depictions of death that serve as reminders of man's mortality. In central and southern Mexico, come late October, markets are filled with folk art, bakery goods, and confections made especially to mark this ritual. On altars, elaborate sugar skulls, one for each of the departed souls, are set out along with papier-mâché or clay skeletons, imitating earthly pursuits. One of the most recognized Day of the Dead images is known as La Calavera Catrina, a smiling skeleton outfitted as a fancy society lady.
The little figures, the little muertitos, right, the little dead, remind us about how sacred life is. Because when you take away the superficiality of what you're wearing and what you do and how much you've earned, and you know, whether you were black, white, brown, green, polka dotted or whatever, what's left is the essence of your humanity. And that's how did you enrich others' lives, you know? How did your life impact other lives? What value were you here on earth, you know? And it's not the quantity of the life that you've lived, it's the quality of the life that you've lived. And these little skeletons, you know, when everything is stripped from you, all that's left is the bones. And the bones, you know, the bones are the commonality. You know, what is one skeleton's going to look at the other and say, oh, what color were you? And base all of their actions on that, you know. And these little skeletons remind us about how fragile, how sweet, how delightful life is. And that's why, like, especially in Mexican culture, you see them always mimicking or continuing their lives as we do on a daily basis, no? And they remind us that how fragile life is.
Each year, Mary Lou introduces more people to Day of the Dead customs through her workshops, community shrines, and home altar tours.
Now, I'm not giving instruction on Altar 101, no? I'm not doing that. I don't attempt to do that. What I want them to remember is that this is a Mexica tradition in the manner that I'm teaching them. But what I want them to do is to be able to go home and create for themselves a sacred space that lets them put themselves in their own timeline of what those images that are sacred to them and those people, especially those people, those muertos, that allows their dead to come back to remind them where they come from, where they are, and where they're going. Huh? My greatest triumph was having this one married couple participate in the workshops and go on the altar tour with me. And the gentleman was a retired Navy submarine commander. And I encountered them at a theater in Mission Valley. I was going to the movies. And they stopped me and they greeted me with hugs, un cariño. And they said, you know, we wanted to tell you that after we visited with you and we did all of these activities, that it changed our lives. We went home and we built an altar and we put up all the pictures that we could find. We called family members and asking them for pictures. And we invited all of our children and their sons and daughters and our grandchildren and all the family we could gather. And we told stories about our dead. Yeah, they got it, they got it.
Mary Lou is planning to build a public altar this year in San Diego's Chicano Park in remembrance of the thousands of lives lost on September 11th. She's inviting the public to join her on November 1st and participate in making the shrine.
This year we are planning a community celebration, and we build our altars while the celebration is going on, and then we have our ceremony after that and do our ritual from the end of that time until sunrise. We tell people, you know, to bring your offerings, your photographs, your mementos, the food they like, the drink, their favorite flower. I have a lot of cards that I leave out with pen and things for people to make offerings. I tell them, name your dead, remember them, talk to them. I get a lot of letters, despedidas, goodbyes. I get a lot of letters that I keep with the people are doing their nombramiento. They're naming their dead. They're remembering them. And this year I think it's going to be really, really important that we grieve and we remember. And that we remember not just the sorrow of these lives being lost, and not just the lives, but the intellectual power that they're represented, you know, to us. But that allows us to celebrate them so that we can go on. And we need to allow ourselves to grieve, but we also need to celebrate their memory. Because by remembering, we give value. By remembering, we remember the joy, the laughter, the lessons that their life had to teach us. That is what empowers us to go on. That remembrance gives us our humanity. And you want to invite people to join with us, to do this, to manifest our determination to go on and not to forget.
Mary Lou, thank you very much for coming to share with us about the Day of the Dead traditions. And I think you may have inspired a lot of people to participate in putting up altars of their own this year, in a year when our nation has suffered such a tremendous loss. Appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
We close tonight with Anthony DePalma. He's the New York Times correspondent who has written extensively about the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and tonight he shares his insight about changing relationships among the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Duality is a part, an inevitable part of the new American continent. Mexico's trade with the United States has doubled over the last decade, but Mexico still protects Pemex. Canada has lost Eaton's, one of its historic homegrown department store chains, a national chain equivalent of our Sears, but it still has crown corporations running the Postal Service, its atomic energy program, and at least for a few more weeks, its undersea coal mines in Cape Breton. It might seem that images of coming together but staying separate are contradictory, but North America has always been that way. I spent a lot of time in here trying to give a sense of the incredible history of what Columbus called this mighty continent and the many intriguing aspects of our common history. That meant focusing on our differences, but also on the common aspects of our history. Take, for instance, the very different natures of our government. Then look at the fact that the man revered as the founder of Canada, Samuel de Champlain, first was intoxicated by the promise of the New World during a trip to New Spain. And was he impressed? A more beautiful country could not be seen or desired than the Kingdom of New Spain, is what he reported to his backers back in Paris. More than anything else, he said, it was Mexico City that dazzled him, just as it had smitten Cortez a century earlier. All the contentment I felt at the sight of things so pleasing was but little in regard to what I experienced when I beheld this beautiful city of Mexico, which I had not supposed to be so superbly constructed of splendid temples, palaces, and fine houses. He went back to Paris post-haste, raised as much money as he could, and hightailed it back to the St. Lawrence, where in 1608 he founded the city of Quebec. The central occurrence, as many of you know, of Mexico's history was La Conquista, and the troubled way in which Mexicans have had to deal with the fact of their founding is reflected in the way that today you would not find one statue of Cortez standing in any public place in Mexico. The central occurrence of Canada's history also is the conquest, and the troubled way in which Canadians have had to deal with the fact of their founding and the defeat of the French by the English is a tortured constitution that guarantees equal rights to all citizens, but says that some citizens are more equal than others because they speak French, are Catholic, or live in Quebec. In our own history, the closest we come to a chapter on the conquest is to tell the story of how the West was won. Until recently, we skimmed entirely over the conquest of Native Americans. We justified our conquest of Mexico in a war instigated to grab Mexican territory. And we rationalized the battles and posturing with Great Britain over the fate of Canada, for which we left an easy entry clause in the Articles of Confederation should the Canadians ever have come to their senses and decided to join the United States. I participated in a radio call-in show recently from Canada, and I was asked whether the United States would even want Canada if the country gave up trying to be a country and wanted to annex itself to the United States. It's a real Canadian question. But what they were asking at the heart of it was, will borders disappear? While I contend that our borders have never meant less than they do now, I told them that I did not believe that the borders are going to disappear. I don't think we have the same incentive as did Europe to form a continental union. After all, we haven't been fighting each other with horrible results for much of the last century as they have. We've managed to make our economy and the economies of Mexico and Canada more competitive and to increase trade many-fold without forming a union, and I think the benefits of going that far are fairly limited for any of the three countries. But what is also clear is that integration is a process that is still proceeding, and that the degree to which we get involved with each other and each other's problems will continue to grow. There are also numerous signs that are coming to be more evident every day that we've outgrown NAFTA, which is a commercial agreement and not a political one after all. The dispute over trucks entering into the United States is just one fairly simple example of how we have exceeded the reach of the agreement. Much more complex are the problems arising from NAFTA's Chapter 11, in which disputes between investors and the government of the nations in which the investments are made can be brought before arbitration panels for resolution. What's not understood is that what they did in setting it up was to basically pull this mechanism off the shelf. We were trying to establish rules on which to resolve issues and not leave it to posturing and threats. Well, that's good. Better to have rules that at least you know what they're going to be and you can rely on having them applied. But the structure of the mechanism is taking from existing rules for settling international trade disputes. Secrecy in those cases was needed to encourage the private companies to engage in the arbitration. But that same secrecy contradicts the need for transparency and openness required of government dealings. Cases like the one now involving the Canadian company Methanex here in California, if you're not aware of it, the company is asking for nearly $1 billion in compensation because of California's decision to ban the additive MTBE. Methanex says that would be tantamount to expropriation of the investment that it made to produce methanol for the additive. I have to tell you, every time I buy gas in New Jersey or New York at a Gulf station, there's a big sign that says, quite happily, with MTBE, like it was supposed to be something that we're glad to have in there. Also surpassing the capabilities of the limited side accords of labor and the environment that were put in 1993 to get the NAFTA through Congress. We are daily facing the challenge to bring a measure of equity to the economic integration that's taking place. As the economy was growing through the 90s and things were good, the attention was focused on the millions of jobs that were created and little attention was given to the displaced workers in American and Canadian industries. Now things are changing. The danger, as we saw in the front lines of the protest in Quebec at the Summit of the Americas, where, by the way, I took a rubber bullet in the stomach for the cause of journalism and truth, is that complex issues like these can be reduced to slogans, and disenchantment grows to a fury almost without control. The danger is that the tribalism and xenophobia that had been the cause of the mistrust that President Fox was trying to say had disappeared could easily return. Now we are negotiating a continental energy policy. But 25 years ago, Mexico had walls around its economy, and Canada instituted a national energy program that kept its energy out of American hands. Today, I hear Canadians expressing some of the same doubts and suspicions about U.S. interest in water and their participation in shared defense projects. What we need to focus on now, I think, is not quick fixes or one-shot deals. It's not enough anymore to just tinker with the badly flawed temporary worker programs that were discussed last week. We need to recognize that the old way of working out problems in North America doesn't work so well anymore. We need a new three-sided relationship based on rules, not power and intimidation. The promise of the new American continent is a vision of our three countries working together in a very different and modern way. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's never going to be a relationship without problems. But it's important to realize that North America is a testing ground for the 21st century. If the U.S. is to lead, it needs to listen to others. Doesn't mean we give up on principle, but it means that we must be willing to see an issue whole. We must be willing to look through somebody else's knothole in the fence. Nothing else that happens anywhere in the world is more important to the day-to-day lives of most Americans than what happens in North America. But this is not just about North America. We can't hope to be able to lead in a world filled with people who both admire and resent us until we get it right here. Thank you.
And that completes our program for tonight. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again in December. I'm Peter Smith. Good night.